Good morning, everyone. My name is Fiona York and I'm the Executive Officer of Housing for the Aged Action Group. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people and the various traditional lands of the people joining us online. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any elders joining us today. I would also like to highlight that First Nations people are disproportionately affected by the housing crisis that we're talking about today. So we're really excited to be here today to launch this important piece of research with Swinburne University of Technology and National Shelter, which has been funded by our philanthropic partner, the Wicking Trust. HAG specialises in the needs of older people in Victoria, and we're a community organisation that's been around for over 40 years. One of our founding members is with us today. I acknowledge your hard work over many years too, Bernie. We now have over 850 members from across the country, and some of them are joining us online. And we're committed to finding long-term solutions to the housing crisis facing older people. So I'd just like to acknowledge our chairperson, Pam, and other members of our Committee of Management today, and members of the public service and our sector colleagues, including John Engler, the CEO of National Shelter, and David Wright-Howie from CODA Australia, and Susie Meeker from the Wicking Trust. And of course, a big welcome to all of our members, especially the regional members who have made the effort to come in today. Couple of little housekeeping matters before we get going. So this is being recorded on Zoom and we have Guru taking photos. Where are you, Guru? If you could pop your hand up. If people are not wanting to have their photo taken, can they please let someone on staff know, and we'll make sure that those photos aren't published. Of course, anyone on Zoom that doesn't want to be recorded should turn off their camera. The bathrooms are here. And if anyone on Zoom has any questions, they can pop them in the chat and one of the staff will come in the Q&A section later and we can ask some questions. So today we're here to launch some groundbreaking research about a group of people that we've been really concerned about here at HAG for a long time. But before now, we've never been able to quantify the size of this group of people and adequately support them with a policy response. As an organisation that supports older people who are experiencing housing challenges, one of the cohorts that we find really difficult to support are older people who are over the asset limit for public and community housing, but don't have enough money to be able to find appropriate and affordable housing in the private market. So this is the group that we're referring to as the missing middle. They're caught in a policy gap or a blind spot where they're forced to spend their life savings in private rental until they get to a crisis point and then they're able to access public and community housing in theory. So today's research that we're launching looks at the national picture, but as we'll hear as we go through the day, this area of policy is complex due to the different eligibility criteria and support services available across different states and territories. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, and it requires genuine cooperation between all levels of government, the community and the finance sector to adequately address this issue. So we have a packed agenda and a really great lineup of speakers, but the first person that I'd like to invite to the microphone is Vera Consadine. Vera is a retired corporate accountant who has experienced 4 years of homelessness. She's now the Secretary of Fair Go for Pensioners and is on HAG's Committee of Management, and she lives in community housing. So Vera, I'd like to welcome you up to the stage.
Thank you, Fiona. It's to the elders of the land that we meet today. May I have my... Yes, there we go. Now, before I explain, this is partly my life journey from age 42 to 78. Quite a large chunk out of my life. And I would like to explain to you why an 83-year-old granny would be standing up here and recounting the horrible experience of my life when I could be at home in a rocking chair with a nice cup of tea. All right. But there's unfinished business. That's the reason. And last year in August, I was invited to join a delegation of older women who had experienced homelessness in Canberra. It was an irresistible invitation, but I really did not like the idea of having to come out as a homeless woman or an older woman who had experienced homelessness. It's something I had hidden when I was homeless. In fact, my sister once said, "But you were never homeless. You had plenty of friends to stay with." That's how well I managed to hide 4 years of homelessness. Now, I was very reluctant about coming out in Canberra, but anyway, I went along and I got the surprise of my life when I met the other delegates. These delegates were all older women who had experienced homelessness. They were all very well-spoken, very well-educated, professional women. And suddenly I didn't feel like such a dummy after all. Now, we bravely faced the politicians and the media and told our stories, but we also shared stories over coffee. And the one common denominator that we found that we all had was a marriage breakup. And that's where my story starts, with the broken marriage. Hubby goes one way, right? Hubby goes one way with half the house, half the mortgage and a new girlfriend, and I go the other way, half the house, half the mortgage and an 11-year-old daughter. Now, I felt terribly guilty about dragging my daughter out of private school, away from her friends, putting her into a whole new environment, and I was determined to give her a reasonable teenage life at least. And so I sacrificed my career, and I wouldn't say I felt that that's what I was doing, but I stayed at home for the next 5 years until she was 16, sewing, bookkeeping, doing a bit of this and that, until she was 16. And at 16, I got back onto decided to get back to work, got back onto the corporate ladder on the bottom rung at that stage at $32,000 a year with no superannuation. And over the next 18 years, I was with that company and we built it up from $250,000 turnover to $15 million turnover, and my salary went from $32,000 to $85,000. So I must have been reasonably financially savvy to be able to manage that. At 62 and a half, which was retirement age at that time, I was called into the boardroom and I was told, "Thank you very much for your services, but we want a younger image for the company." And yeah, okay, I took that on the chin. What I didn't like was when I found out that my replacement, my younger image, younger man, was coming in at a starting salary of $120,000 a year to my 85. Now that's quite normal, and that's why women end up at retirement with 1/3 less than men. So yes, as I say, I took it on the chin. I actually thought I'd probably get another job the next day, but no, a 62-and-a-half-year-old woman is an old woman and she does not get any other job. That's just the way it is. But it took me 6 months for that to sink in. And over that period of time, I paid my mortgage out of the small amount of superannuation that I did have. And the bank very generously offered me a reverse mortgage to pay for my mortgage. And I knew that within 4 years they'd own the whole house. So I thought, no, that's not such a good idea. So I put the house on the market, sold it within a month. All the costs involved in selling a house, as you well know, you've got sprucing it up, advertising, agent's commission, paying off the mortgage. I was left with $120,000. Now, in today's market, that would be equal to about $300,000. And I thought I could downsize. So, well, No. And by that stage, I was getting used to the idea that I was retired. And I thought, well, I'll go to Centrelink and get some advice. So I had to take bank statements, birth certificates, a few other strange things. And I thought, well, and they gave me a forensic interview. At the end of it, they kept me waiting for half an hour and they came back and said, well, you've got $120,000 in the bank. We don't even know why you're here. We can't help you. And that wasn't really why I went to them. I went to them for advice on how I could preserve that money through my retirement with housing, with whatever there was available through social services for somebody who was in retirement. No, absolutely not. And so it's at that point that I fell into, and women fall into the vortex. Now, it's the vortex of unaffordable rent, because there's no choice. There is nothing. There is no housing. Up at that point, there should be affordable housing for women in retirement and for everybody who needs, anybody retiring on a low income. There should be affordable housing at that point, but there isn't. And you kind of go into it thinking, well, I'll just rent for 6 months, sort myself out. But once you're in the vortex, and it is a vortex, it's a horrible, noisy vortex that and I think I've described it in here as best I could. Let me see where, just to actually get it in the right context, I'll describe it here. To describe that vortex, it is a noisy, discombobulating suction environment filled with greedy landlords, developers, scammers, banks, all offering special deals. You are stressed, bewildered, separated from your family, and you clutch onto all these offerings, hoping that you won't fall because there is no safety net. As your finances are depleted, the ever-increasing rentals, you spin faster and faster until you emerge with $0 out the bottom. And there you are, with a suitcase and hopefully a mobile phone, a Gmail address, and I was lucky enough to have a car, because every homeless woman has to have a mobile phone, a Gmail address and a car to stay invisible. So at that point, back to Centrelink, because at that stage, well, I did have nothing, except on the way down, the bank offered me an extension on my credit card, which I took. So I came out the bottom with no money, but a credit card debt. So back to Centrelink. Well, yes, you do qualify. You've got nothing. But there's a bit of a problem with housing. There's 125,000 people ahead of you, and it'll take 10 years before we can house you. That's when I became homeless for 4 years. I hid it very well with house sitting, dog sitting, couch surfing, getting around, whatever I did. As I said, even my sister said, you were never homeless, you stayed with friends. Well, no, they were not my friends, but they did help me along the way. And I had to do that for 4 years. And at the end of 4 years, I was able to get a community housing unit in the area that I wanted. And I couldn't tell you how perfect that is for somebody, for an older person in retirement with limited finances. We're all in there together. We help each other. We might do our shopping together, take somebody to the doctor, share books, talk about our grandchildren. We're a happy little community, and I couldn't be happier that I'm there. So in a way, it's all turned out quite well. But in closing, I would just like to say that the government has failed in its duty of care to older women in retirement. Successive governments, whether it's local, state, federal, in opposition or in power, all of them together, have all had a hand in shaping our present social structure, which is now an unsustainably affluent social structure with no infrastructure to back it up. And that has created not just an affordable housing crisis, but a social crisis for 500,000 older women now at risk of homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. That was really fantastic and a great way to set the scene. And I'd also like to acknowledge that many people in the room and online are in a similar situation today, and I can't underestimate the urgency of addressing this issue. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Michelle Anandaraja, who's joined us, and our funder, Susie Meager, who's joined us today as well. So our next speaker is Dr. Piret Veeroja. Dr. Piret is a research fellow at the Centre for Urban Transitions in Housing. Piret's research focuses on the vital role of housing conditions and aspirations in creating equitable and thriving cities. She explores the connection between housing and various aspects of individuals' health, well-being and quality of life. Her work is especially dedicated to addressing the needs of vulnerable groups, including older adults. And she is now going to share with us the research findings from Not Poor Enough, Not Rich Enough, Older People Falling Through the Housing Assistance Eligibility Gap. Welcome, Piret.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your story as introduction for today. I am here to talk about the research and the report we are launching today. And before we start, I would also like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting today. I would also like to say a big thank you for all our research participants who are very generous with their time and their expertise. So why this research was conducted? So on the one hand, we heard this story shared by Vera just now, but in our conversations with HAC, but also based on our research, that we've done before, we know that there is this group of people who share similar stories as Vera just did, but we didn't know how many are there, what is the size of this group, who are they, and therefore we can't really offer proper solutions for them as well without having all this knowledge. But in addition to that, we also know that outright home ownership is one of the very important part of Australians' welfare, and especially when people age. And during the recent decades, we also know that there are fewer people who are able to own their own home. There are more people who retire with mortgages, more older people who retire with mortgages, and more older people who live in private rental sector and also different alternative living arrangements. And we also know that social housing sector has declined. So if there is a spectrum where on the one end there is social housing and on the other end there is outright home ownership, then there is this group of people who are in the middle, and these are who we are concerned about. And in this report, we call them missing middle. So these are people who are at risk of non-supported housing precarity. And as a title of the research, we say that they are not poor enough, which means that they are not eligible or they are not receiving adequate housing assistance, but at the same time, they are not poor enough. So they still have some kind of wealth, but it's probably not enough to secure housing in the future and now as well. But coming now to the research, we carried this out in 3 stages. So, and as I said just before, we didn't really know much about this group. So we started by conceptualizing the missing middle. And this is just to have some framework, so to say, to understand who should be considered. And for that, we looked into housing assistance eligibility criteria in Australian states and territories, also the asset and wealth limits, and things like that. And we also considered unit and dwelling prices across Australia. Then the next step was to operationalize this group. And for that, we used Australian Bureau of Statistics survey of income and housing, which was from 2019 and 20, which is the latest data that this data set. And the analysis was national analysis. And as a final step, really wanted to have a deeper dive and better understanding of who these people are, why they fall into missing middle, and what could be possible solutions. So we interviewed 13 people. 6 of them were older people with lived experience, and 7 were professional stakeholders. Now, a little bit about the research and a little bit about the data before we go to the findings. And here I wanted to say, so we used the housing assistance eligibility criteria to understand and conceptualize the group. But then the data is never perfect, so we sort of had to make these two match with each other. And for that, we had 4 criteria. First of all, of course, we were interested in older people, so people who are 55 years or older. The second criteria was the tenure. So we looked people in private rental sector and owners with mortgage, and also those who are in all kinds of other tenure types. So we didn't include people in social housing and outright ownership. And here, just to note that tenure is important also in policy terms because they would have different solutions as well. Then the third criteria was income, household income. So we considered people in very low, and moderate household incomes. And the last layer was wealth. And we considered different wealth thresholds because the criteria for housing assistance in different states and territories have very different asset limits. And therefore, we considered all these thresholds. Just to say here as well that we didn't consider anyone who had more than 500,000 in wealth as part of the missing middle. And very quickly, a little bit more about data. So you can see all of these measures that we considered when calculating wealth, and I'm not going into this. You can read this in the report, or you can ask me later and send them email. But it's important to know here that wealth in ABS considers wealth in household level, which means that if people live in more complex households, so if there are more than one income unit, we couldn't consider them because we weren't confident enough what is their wealth level. So we could consider households where people lived alone, lived as a couple, were lone parents, or were a couple with children. And based on this, there were about 5 million people who fell into this category, which was 75% of the population. So we don't consider 25%. And when we added the next layer, which was income, then we have about 3.6 million we are considering. But here I just wanted to say that because we couldn't consider this 25%, this also means that this is probably underestimation of the issue because there were about 1 million people whose wealth we couldn't really clearly understand at this stage. And also to note here that the data was from 2019 and 20. It is the latest data collection, but it was still collected before the recent intensification of housing issues. So let's move on to results now. And here we can see that we have about 508,000 people in this missing middle cohort. You can also see that majority of them are in private rental, and about 25% are older people with mortgages. And when you're looking, then you can see that in terms of private renters, most of them are in very low wealth or low wealth missing middle. And this is a little bit different for people with mortgages. So there are more people in moderate wealth, but this is because some of their wealth will be in the dwelling where they're living. And we have a lot of findings and a lot of tables in the report, so you can go and have a look. I'm just highlighting just very few findings here. But as we just saw, most of the missing middle would be in private rental sector, and large majority of them were in very low and low wealth. And here you can see that about 60% were age 65 years or older, so they were in this older age category. 43% were in the very low household income, and 45% in low household income brackets. The large majority wasn't in the public housing list, and quite a large majority are receiving housing assistance in the form of Commonwealth rent assistance. In terms of people who are owning home with mortgage, there are slightly more people in the younger old age group, so 55 to 64 years, and about 40% of them are in Q1, the very low income bracket. To move on, the second part of the work was about the qualitative data and about the interviews. And as I said before, we wanted to know why people fall into this missing middle. And we found out that there are some systematic and macroeconomic drivers, such as that are related to supply, affordability, eligibility criteria, and economic circumstances such as interest rate increases and things like that. And then there are also life events and personal circumstances such as illness or divorce or a death of partner. And here I have a few examples of the qualitative stories as well. So this is one of the professional stakeholders who said that there are people who are actually earning full income, but they are still forced out from the rental homes because the rental prices increase, and they are also faced with cost of living pressures. Then there was an older person who said, "You're just a liability, especially single women who are fallen on hard times through something out of their control. I owned my own home. I had everything. But it was burned down with an electrical fault, and I lost everything because my husband hadn't paid the insurance. Because of my age, the bank wouldn't loan me any money." And there were a few stories like that we heard. Then another part we were interested in were what are the current housing options for people living in the missing middle. And of course, there are the so to say mainstream options, which are public housing and community housing, which was perceived as safe and positive, but quite inaccessible. And also some people said that the neighbors could be troublesome. Then we had the second option was private rental, which was found to be expensive and insecure. And sometimes it's not suitable for older people as well. The next option were residential villages and manufactured villages. These were found to be expensive and had inconsistent contracts, sometimes unfair fees, and difficult management as well. The next options were shared housing and co-op types of living. And these were interesting because some older people and also some professionals mentioned that these are really suitable and good options for some, but not everyone wants to live in these types of living arrangements. And finally, the residential aged care was mentioned, but this was generally very undesirable. And just a few examples as well. This person says, I don't think that there is anything around. I put my name down 17 years ago on public housing, and I've had to apply 3 different times because they keep losing my application. Another person said, you're subject to rental changes. I rented from the time I sold my place. I rented 3 separate units. Each time I had it for 2.5, maybe 3 years, and it was sold. And moving, that costs money too. And the last example is, the government is waiting for you to be really poor before they help you. I don't want to be at the streets. I really don't. I want the future, you know, for my retirement. And to summarize, most older people just wanted to age gracefully, in a housing that meets their needs, is affordable, and is close to their existing networks and services. We have a full session this afternoon about solutions, but our main finding perhaps was that there is no one solution that fits everyone. We need more social housing, we need more affordable housing, and we also need to explore more different housing options. Thank you.
Thank you, Piret. And also a big thanks to Wendy Stone and Maggie Reynolds for this research. It's been hard slog pulling all of this together. As Piret mentioned, the research was conducted, or the data was collected before the current rental and cost of living crisis. And so from our service perspective, we're seeing an increase in the number of older people who are stuck in the private rental market but aren't eligible for anything. And we have created some easy to digest infographics which are available at the back there to talk about some of what we see are the barriers and solutions for this cohort. And we will be talking a little bit more about that shortly. But before we do, I'd like to invite Angelica Walker to the stage, please. Angelica has recently contacted our service and is going to read from a journal, I believe. Come on up, Angelica.
Photographs. Is that right? Not photographs for me, because the flash will. The first thing I've discovered, thank you, is that I'm not alone. Yay. I'm 65. I'm terrified of homelessness, and I'm trying to be as proactive as I can. I think you could probably hear me anyway, can't you? What?
Online people? It's about 100 online.
Okay. So this is really more, I haven't curated anything and I don't have anything up here. I'm not a curated kind of a gal. This is really stream of consciousness talking from my journal about a solution to how I age and how so many women that I know age. And I've just also discovered I'm in the very low wealth missing middle. So that was horrifying, but it's truthful. I think my earnings, my whole earnings are $28,000. That's my life savings. I don't want to talk about how I got here. I'd rather talk about a solution for where I'd like perhaps to go, if that's okay. So I've created an idea of a rich community of elders sharing their skills and wisdom, a therapeutic-centred collective with the goal of becoming a self-reliant and profitable business. A centre for reconnection with meaningful work, a place in society, a mental health hub of alternative skill sets, allowing open communication and services for nourishment of spirit. A connection with community that places value and worth on the wisdom of elders and provides a safe and secure future for them. And I know this isn't for everybody. I'm an introvert, believe you me, this doesn't always appeal to me either, but it's a great alternative because I know so many women in this situation. So in his book, Lost Connections by Johann Hari, Why You're Depressed and How to Find Hope, he researched and found 9 causes of depression and anxiety. And I hope to address 7 of these through the establishment of a collective of elders, drawing on our life experiences and skill sets. My vision is a reconnection to meaningful work, meaningful values, other people, status and respect, and a hopeful and secure future. I hope to also find the necessary women with psychological, mental health and counselling skills to allow childhood trauma to be addressed. Now, I talked with Robin before and she's a social worker. That would be fantastic, those sorts of skills. Women of my age and older have so many skills and so much life experience. We should be a pool of resources, not a problem. Gardeners, cooks, nutrition experts, and after a lifetime of living, we have become, having raised children and created homes as one avenue, for example, that address our disconnection from the natural world. And that's a huge issue too. I just want to become an environmental activist when my old age. These are not woven. These are not women who have experienced superannuation security and have had less opportunity due to the gender pay gap to secure resources that allow a retirement of any means. Due to taking care of children and forced to do part-time work, death of partners or divorce, plus most care work being done by women and being the least paid work. The largest growing group of people experiencing homelessness is now women over 55. I think we've established that. I am presenting a model that will not only decrease the statistic, but also tap into the resourcefulness, creativity, and resilience of women. The one criteria for joining a collective will be a skill set they can offer that adds value to our business model. In return, they get accommodation at a reasonable rent that allows them security and dignity. The business model will be unique and add meaning and value to their lives. I believe this could be an alternative model to nursing homes, aged care, and grandmothers living on the streets, of which there is way too many already happening. In an increasingly disconnected world, a collective of wisdom, or I call it a gaggle of old girls, is becoming a necessity and something that is urgently required. There is no place on earth where women are equal to men, and Australia is especially bad, says Sam Moyston, who is chair of the Albanese government's Women's Economic Equality Task Force. Women here rate first internationally for educational attainment, so we're obviously smart, but are 38th for economic participation, due to caring for children, partners, homes, etc., elderly parents too. That's from the Good Weekend, the 21st, July the 21st, 2023, A Woman's Work. That was Wifedom, the book by Anna Funden that was being reviewed. So we are resilient, intelligent, creative, imaginative, empathetic, and doomed to poverty in an increasingly difficult economic climate, it would seem. All these qualities we poured into our work, into our relationships, into our homes, and into our children are the qualities that will help us conceive a better world of meaning and value. I'm proposing a new model for eldership that is based on meaning, value, and security. And this is a quote from a book, The Robberies of Age, The Case for Elderhood in a Time of Trouble by Stephen Jenkinson. We're missing something fundamental about what it means to be a human and to be coming to the end of our lives in a way that traces our humanity, that leaves the rumour that it is good to be alive, even still, in the air, that makes of us ancestors worth claiming in the times of trouble that are surely coming, that I think are actually already here. There are many more old people than ever before, and it seems that there are fewer elders than ever before. But I think older women are a great resource for tapping into eldership for all that we've been through. There's estimated 1 million empty homes in Australia at present, and homelessness is on the increase. Such a disconnect cannot continue to occur. So I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and tertiary education was free. We never imagined there'd be a time that they would charge our children ridiculous amount of money in order to get an education, because we thought that upskilling and educating would just be a first priority for our government. I never thought we'd ever get here, and all of us back there never did. Hence, I studied half an arts degree and an acting degree. So job security wasn't high on my list at that point. Unfortunately, old white men and capitalism got married, and it's been downhill ever since. The 70s weren't all great. That no decade is if you live outside the margins of a white colonial patriarchal world. So, like I said, I started an art degree, but on top of that, I studied in no particular order, psychosynthesis, remedial massage, Swedish massage, psychoperistaltic massage, Reiki, orosoma, numerology, astrology, tarot reading, bark flower remedies, bush flower remedies. We all did that in the 70s and 80s. But these are still great alternative skills. These are still great skills that we can offer people now. We can offer people alternatives, and we can just offer them food. We can offer them a cup of tea. So I'm imagining like motels, or like there's a lot of empty warehouses. You give that to a gaggle of old girls and they'll make it into this great place with a big kitchen where people can come and meet. So you're getting an idea of what I'm saying? Is this coming across? Good. So that's enough. Rebecca said to me, what did I want you to take away from my stream of consciousness ramblings here? So what do I want you to take away? I want people to see that women like myself are valuable. Not just women as maidens, which is so much of our world, which is youth oriented, not just as mothers, but as us crones. Now, crone means crowned one. Hag means holy one. Even witch means wise one. So we like to call ourselves crones, hags and witches. And hopefully for government policy to reflect that. We see ourselves reflected in your eyes. So remember that. We're each a reflection and a mirror for each other. I loved your speech, by the way, Vera. Also, we choose what we value. We forget that we have the choice to choose what we value. So we at the moment value bricks and mortar, but I value the earth. I value relationships. I value you and I value me.
That was great, lest we never forget the wisdom of older women. Thank you so much, Angelica. That was fantastic. Now I'm going to get onto some of the solutions. It's great to have such a beautiful vision as well to have in our minds as we go forward, and to think about how we can adjust the government policies and the decision makers thinking around solutions for this complex issue, which does unfortunately require multiple interventions and policy solutions. So firstly, to discuss some of these solutions, I would now like to invite Emma Greenhalgh, the CEO of National Shelter, to the podium. National Shelter is the peak body that has been around for 50 years, and 50th year this year, I believe, or next year. Aimed at improving housing access, affordability, appropriateness, safety and security for older people on low incomes. And Emma is a passionate advocate for better housing outcomes, having worked for 25 years in roles in housing policy, research, social impact assessment and planning in both non-government and government roles. So come on up, Emma.
Just bring it down further for the short people. I'd just like to say it's my privilege to be here on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. And I'd just like to acknowledge the elders of the various lands that are joining us online. This event's occurring not only during the Victorian Seniors Festival, but we're also meeting during Anti-Poverty Week. And more than 1 in 4 older Australians live in poverty, and housing costs are a significant contributor to poverty for older people, particularly those in the private rental market. And when we speak of older people, as we know, we're often talking of people of those who are aged 55 years and older. It's my privilege also to be here to speak to this report and support the work of the Housing for the Aged Action Group and Swinburne University. This is my last formal engagement for National Shelter, and I couldn't actually be more privileged to say that it's for HARG. Their tireless work and dedication to housing circumstances of older people in Victoria and nationally is to be commended. I won't speak too much to this report because you've heard from the researchers and from people with lived experience, and you'll be able to read the results for yourself. But what the report demonstrates is that people want housing security, and more often than not, they want to be able to look after themselves, with many having, some of the means to be able to do so. And they do not want to navigate a system or necessarily rely on others. Like all of us, older people want to be able to secure a home with dignity. And I know this might sound like some sort of random political sort of anecdote with apologies, but yesterday on my flight, I actually sat next to somebody who asked, what was I coming to Melbourne for, and talked to them about the report. And they mentioned a good friend of theirs whose husband had died during COVID, and this was an older woman, and she'd been taken for granted financially by her son and was now having to be in share houses and doing this for 18 months. She did have some equity, something that would actually be a deposit, but at 65 years, she can't get a loan. She wants security and dignity, so she can make a contribution, but there is nowhere that she can realistically go. She can't apply for social housing, and if she relies on the private market, the money that she has will just get whittled away until she is in poverty. Vera's explanation of a vortex is the most appropriate way, I think, to describe the experience. You need to become poor and vulnerable to get assistance. So what is it that we need? I think first of all, we need a sustained and significant pipeline of social and affordable housing, a pipeline that's going to meet the current and predicted demand. We understand from modelling from the Community Housing Industry Association that there will be an unmet housing need of almost 1 million households by 2041. And that's in the bottom 2 quintiles. Not all of those households will require social and affordable housing. Some may require another form of assistance, and that could include Commonwealth rent assistance. But that's a 1 million households that will have unmet need by 2041. For many, even with some equity, social and affordable housing will be the best housing option. And what we need to see is 1 in 10 homes in Australia are social and affordable rental homes. We currently have 4%, but we need to be getting to 10% to meet that demand, the existing demand and the future demand. And the reason why we have such restrictive policies on social housing is because we only have that 4% of stock as social housing. The lack of investment in so long has residualised and cannibalised the sector to the point that applicants are waiting decades on the register. So how do we get to 10%? What we would like to see is the federal government quadrupling the HAF. National Shelter has supported the HAF because we've seen how vulnerable social housing funding is, and it's a tap that gets turned on and off by federal governments and by state and territory governments. So National Shelter, the Community Housing Industry Association and Homelessness Australia have been making representations for the last 6 months to the federal government, to backbenchers, and last week with the Minister to substantially increase the Housing Australia Future Fund. Quadruple it so it can provide capital grants along with the current availability payments and become a constant recurring source of funding. Make the states put in equivalent contributions to their HAF applications so that it can go much, much further. What we need is an ongoing pipeline that's locked in and it's not subject to the whims of political parties. We'd also like to see mandatory inclusionary zoning on a national scale and ensuring that all development has a mix of social and affordable housing. But what we also need is rental reform, where the experience of renting is not within the context of home ownership and where it is a well-functioning rights-based framework. So we've seen a really good start across Australia with the National Cabinet Better Deal for renters, but we must really keep going. This includes limits on the amount of rent increases. We've seen that in the Australian Capital Territory, and other states could be able to do that. Finally, we cannot talk about housing precarity without talking about income support, and particularly during Anti-Poverty Week. For many older people from the age of 55 to at least 67, they're on job seeker. they're not on the pension. And if we want to make the housing experience of very low income households better, then we need to give those who are on job seeker a decent payment. It will be life-changing and it will save lives. What this report and the experience of older women and older people who are not in home ownership demonstrates to us is the absolute urgency of fixing our broken housing system today. If we want to know what the future looks like in terms of precarity and poverty into old age, we only need to look at the experience of older people, particularly older women now. The continued decline of home ownership and residualisation of social housing will mean we have more relying on the private rental into old age. And while more may have superannuation, superannuation is not a housing policy. This report adds to the existing evidence and the need for urgency and momentum to fixing our housing crisis, and we cannot say that we weren't warned. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. As she mentioned, she's sadly leaving National Shelter and this is her last event. So we're really honoured to have her here today. And I have to also say that as CEO, she's been a breath of fresh air. She's really brought the sector together and pushed the government to take meaningful action, championing the needs of older women in particular. So we're going to miss you. We're now going to talk a little bit about some of the solutions. As I mentioned, we do have some information at the back which really unpacks some of the things that are existing for older people and some of the things that aren't existing for older people in this cohort. And there is no one size fits all, as Piret mentioned, and we do need a range of solutions. So as well as addressing the supply issues by increasing the Housing Australia Future Fund and addressing the challenges in the rental market, we do need to think about what other options are there for people with low and medium amounts of wealth. So as the report points out, we have about 97,000 older renters who have very low wealth, and this is less than $35,000, which means that they're eligible for public and community housing, but only 14% are on the wait list. So this indicates that there is a need for specialist support services to assist older people to access that opportunity, and as well as the increase in supply. And that is what our Home at Last service does. It assists people to access public and community housing. So here in Victoria, we have the lowest asset limit of any state and territory, and you won't get priority unless you have even less than that, $14,000 or a bit more than that. So what this research is also demonstrating is that there is a large number of older people with low and moderate household wealth who basically don't have any solutions and are stuck in the private rental market. So-called affordable housing is not available to older people on very low or low incomes, and the definition of affordable is tied to market prices, which everybody knows is not affordable, and it's not tied to income. So it's not actually genuinely affordable for many of the older people who are identified in this research. For those who have moderate wealth, and there's about 69,000 people in that cohort, retirement housing may be an option, and it is an attractive option for many people who want to downsize and feel safe living in a community. But currently, as you may have seen on the 7:30 report, it's very under-regulated, it has unfair fees, it has poor management, and it has a lack of dispute resolution. In the past, independent living units were an attractive option for people with moderate wealth or those looking for long-term rental options. But this sector has been in decline for many years after it lost federal government support in the 1980s. So every time somebody contacts us, we provide them with information on independent living units, but we're seeing them slowly disappear. And that's because they're often in good places with expensive land, and so people are selling them, and they're getting turned into more expensive types of retirement housing, or the people that are providing this type of housing are really struggling to maintain the ageing stock and to increase the stock to modern standards. There's also a number of existing financial products that are offered by different levels of governments, but none of them are suitable or designed with older people in mind. For example, the shared equity schemes or build to rent to buy schemes that currently exist require approval for commercial bank loans, which we've heard today, older people can't get that approval. They also often have stringent requirements around previous home ownership, and many older people, such as older women fleeing family violence or after divorce, have been in home ownership in the past, which means that they're no longer eligible. So these options are just not working for the hundreds of thousands of people that have moderate wealth. And so we're calling on the government to create a shared equity scheme to help these people. The eligibility for this scheme should be designed specifically with older people in mind and their circumstances. It might include things like not subjecting previous property ownership as a criteria, or it may include something like government facilitated bank loans instead of requiring the banking sector to approve those loans. And we're very much open to working with government to tease out some of the details of what these shared equity arrangements might look like to benefit the people with moderate incomes, moderate wealth. So given the current housing crisis, it's in everyone's interest to ensure that older people remain in their home and to be able to age in place as long as possible. But we've also identified through this research that there are a number of people who are likely to fall out of home ownership without some government intervention, and these are purchasers who are on low incomes at retirement age. There is a scheme for people who are on the pension who are struggling to pay their mortgage. It's called the Home Equity Access Scheme, but it's not currently available to anybody under the age of pension age, so 55 to 67 at the moment. And then the last thing before we go on to the panel discussion I wanted to mention is that to develop better policies, we need better data. So this research was based on survey done in 2019, 2020, and it has some limitations, as Piret mentioned, in terms of how we can accurately estimate individuals' wealth. So we really would like to see an improvement in the data collection so this cohort is no longer invisible and we can actually start to look at genuine solutions. So speaking of solutions, I'm now going to invite Professor Wendy Stone and Julijana Todorovic up to the stage to have a chat about some of the options. Professor Wendy Stone is from Swinburne University of Technology, and she's part of the group of academics who worked with us originally on the Ageing in the Housing Crisis report, which we launched last year, and on this current report. So she is a Professor of Housing and Social Policy in the Centre for Urban Transitions at Swinburne University of Technology, and she conducts research into the intersection of people's housing needs and aspirations, the adequacy of available housing, and the policy development and innovation needed to address housing gaps. Julijana Todorovic is a land rights lawyer and the co-founder and co-convener of Labor for Housing, a national advocacy organisation striving to achieve better and fairer housing party within the Australian Labor Party. Labor for Housing has been instrumental in driving reform in state and federal Labor government and plays a key role between the housing sector, the Labor Party membership and government. So, should we get those mics happening? Should I stand here or shall I sit down? Shall I sit down? Okay. I know, now I know. They work? Oh, they do. Karaoke time. All right, I'm going to start with you, Wendy. So you've been deeply involved in this report. What did you find unexpected in these findings, and what can you tell us about this research that should inform policy and decision makers?
Thanks, Fiona. Just an easy one to start off with. I guess before addressing your question, it's also an opportunity to pay my respects in regards to elders of this land, but also to the people with lived experience in the room and online. It's been an absolute privilege to be working with HAG over a few years now, and to really understand even more deeply the kind of research that we do on a day-to-day basis through these relationships. So thank you so much. And also acknowledging members of the panel here and Emma on this amazing day. So the thing there are a few things that are surprising. One is that it's actually, the way we, Piret described the data really clearly. When we look at the data, what we found is that we had to make decisions about cut-off points and how to present the data. That's just the way data and eligibility and all these things work to make them workable. But there are really clear groupings of population groups. There are clear cohorts of people that kind of come out in the evidence. So we, as Piret described really clearly, I thought that there's a group of people living in the private rental sector who have probably not started there. Some of them may have, but they've whittled back their savings or their wealth to that point where it's very, very low. And for these people, we need social housing and community housing. I guess the sort of surprising thing to me is these solutions and the groups are so clear. It's a no-brainer. It's basically almost the surprising point. What we can see, though, is that there are groups of people also in the private rental sector who, from other research we've done around housing aspirations, what people want as they age, we know that a majority of people do not necessarily want to live in social housing, even though it can be a very good option. People want a sense of empowerment. They want choices about where they live, about the type of dwelling they're living in, about the neighbours they have, about who's eligible to live in their home with them, whether they have to make these hard choices about their young adult children or their teenagers having to leave home because they're going to push them out of eligibility criteria. These are things that are really hard. I think the other thing that is growing, though, is likely this group of people retiring. We know from other evidence, this is cross-sectional, just one point in time we've presented today. From our other evidence, we know that the group of people reaching retirement, sorry about that, thanks, Dinny, retirement age without having paid out their mortgage debt is a time bomb. Basically, this will be a growing cohort. We know that people we've talked about people 55 and over, people at midlife just below these years are also living with high mortgage debt, unlikely to pay it out in the same kinds of proportions that we experienced previously for older generations. So this is just a ticking time bomb. Unless we actually create some pathways and supported home ownership pathways for these groups, we're going to be in real strife. It's going to be costly for people at an individual level, for a community level, for a societal level at the economic scale. But also, I guess, what we knew before doing this research, we didn't know the numbers, is that there are no current accessible housing policy solutions for this group. We need, as per other countries, there are several examples internationally of mortgage relief, purchaser relief. We really need to think about this space. The more that we can maintain people in their homes, the better it is for everyone in so many ways. We have a wellbeing national budget, and the more that we can join the dots from housing solutions to that budget at the scale of individual wellbeing, communities and nationally, the better. So the surprising thing for me is that the solution, that the groups are obvious, they're growing, and the solutions are kind of clear. We just need to get on with them in a way.
Thank you. I mentioned also we will have an opportunity for people to ask questions in the audience too. So if people online want to pop them in the chat, then they can somehow get to us, and of course pop your hand up as well. Julijana, so what about you? Was there anything in the research that you found surprising? And I'd particularly like to hear about your thoughts on the lack of existing shared equity models.
Yeah, absolutely. And I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung people, and also Emma Greenhalgh, who is going to be a phenomenal loss to the sector. But she'll still be involved, and I imagine a lot of us will still be calling her regularly. Look, this research really put into two clear things for me. Firstly is how fundamentally our retirement system is predicated on home ownership. And that's not talked about enough. And we actually don't have any other policy solutions that we're working towards where home ownership isn't the solution for retirement. The second thing is the paradox that Vera spoke so eloquently and so beautifully to around if you have too many assets and too much wealth, you essentially have to go through a process of depletion to deplete your assets to achieve safe and secure housing, which is mind-boggling. And the third thing is that housing is fundamentally a generational problem in this country. It is very much in terms of my generation, millennials and Gen Z, but we are not talking about the generational problem that we have at the other end of the spectrum. And I don't personally think 55 and 65 is particularly old. So whether it's a reframing of this critical part of our society who, as Angelica said, still have so much to offer, but talking about generations and capacity. And although the notion of first home buyers is politically very attractive, there's a lot of voting group, 508,000 people in the missing middle is also a significant voting bloc. So I think changing the narrative around where this generational crisis exists is also really important. To your question about shared equity schemes, shared equity schemes are fantastic. For those who don't quite understand how they work, essentially the government will purchase the property with you, and so I actually use the Victorian scheme as shared. I don't have sort of parents to support me, so in my property, you come in with 5% deposit, so I own 5%. The government owns 25%, and then the bank owns the rest of it. But they let you live in it, which is great. So I think that with the scheme that is before the Parliament at the moment, which is the federal scheme, we're looking at a scheme where the government can own up to 40% of the property. You can come in with a 2% deposit. And the only sort of requirements are income requirements. So for the federal scheme, it's as an individual, you can't own more than $95,000. Is that correct, Dr. Michelle? Yep, 90. And that's all, and own no other property. Now, in the Victorian scheme, as far as we can understand from the legislation of the federal scheme, it's not that you have to be a first home buyer, but it's that you have to own no other property. And that's not talked about enough. And if we're not talking about it enough, the bureaucrats who are approving all these loans and looking at all the applicants aren't understanding the critical missing middle who should be also being able to access that scheme. Now, whether we need to look at having a focus on that group for these schemes, or whether we need to, as Labor for Housing is putting forward, expand the scheme for an additional 40,000 places that has a targeted cap for the missing middle, I think is another way. But as you've touched on, Fiona, we have to look at the lending laws that are preventing older people being able to obtain loans. I'm not suggesting anything that has been in the media recently around relaxing responsible lending laws. I think this scheme works really well now to protect vulnerable people, but we've got a real ageism issue, and I think that can be pretty easily addressed through policy.
Thank you. Now to you, Emma. As we've mentioned, there's a significant differences across the country, and as a national body, you'd be aware of this in relation to the eligibility for public and community housing, especially in relation to asset limits. And so what this means is that people in Victoria who have $50,000 are in a completely different boat to people in Queensland with $50,000. How do you think we can bring national consistency across that sector so that it's not so inequitable?
Without removing that little thing called federation, which is having a lot of fun at the moment in the housing policy debate. But I think one of the ways potentially could be through, so I mean, one is with the national plan, but I think in terms of the national agreement, so probably the National Housing and Homelessness agreement, to try and get some consistency across jurisdictions. I think not just in terms of, I think, the eligibility requirements, but that relates to assets, but probably also in terms of income. But I think we've just also got to remember that the reason why we've got such stringent, eligibility requirements is because we've just let social housing become, we've not funded it to the extent that we've needed to. So we've just made it more and more difficult and more highly targeted, for households to be able to be in there, whereas previously, it wasn't so, it wasn't so targeted. So I think there'd probably be quite a contentious argument across the states and territories to get some sort of parity around that eligibility, but I think it would need to come through something like the housing agreement, potentially, aligned with funding or something like that as well, because I don't think states are going to move on their own. But one of the things I'd really like to think would happen is we start to see, with an increase in social housing, that we start to relax some of that eligibility, so that it isn't about people waiting years. So I think, from a Victorian perspective, that when we hopefully see an increase in the proportion of social housing, that government will actually start to relax what that eligibility looks like, for people who want to be in social housing.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions that they'd like to ask? No, great. I've got more. Don't worry. I thought I'd give you the opportunity though. So Wendy, we've been talking about how there's very few existing financial products and models to support older people to age in place, both for purchasers and for those in private rentals. So what were your main takeaways for the research around those models of support for older people? And I'd just like to say, can everyone speak right into the mic, because a couple of Zoom people are finding it difficult to hear, is that right? Yeah, okay, cool.
So Fiona, other models or?
Yeah.
So I think what we really need to do is kind of think about how people want to live, and then work backwards into how we create the housing that will suit people well. So from a sort of a housing aspirations lens that we've been doing a lot of work at Swinburne and other universities through the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. What we know is that people want to live not in a tiny flat. They want to live in space and place which is enabling of them to, say, for example, have grandchildren come and stay, look after or support their young adult or midlife adult who's bumping around in the housing system, maybe themselves. So they need dwelling form. They need basically a material form that is adequate, not a shoebox, so that they can live with dignity and be really productive in society. That's one thing. So how do we institutionally deliver that? There are ways and means of that. And we've heard already problems. The problems are clear in remaining in a mortgage. Mortgage stress is forcing people out of their homes. So purchase support schemes, purchase relief schemes really warrant investigation in the Australian context, more so than ever before. We also need to look, I think, at other sorts of opportunities to connect people with one another in the way that Angelica was talking about, but also just to remain in their neighbourhood. So I think there's a real piece here around supporting people to right-size or downsize well. Often people are left to sell their home, they're just whittling back assets, but some supported pathways, working with the financial sectors, working with government-supported programs, around government guarantees to shared equity schemes, whatever those sorts of models could be, they also really warrant looking at in great sort of evidence detail about what could really work well for different kinds of age groupings with different sorts of assets and abilities and capabilities and desires and values. So currently we know when people are sort of forced out of their home, if it's a home ownership situation, there's not always adequate, appropriate housing nearby. They need to stay connected. We know that. People want to age well. They need to thrive. There's so much possibility. I think that came through in, both Vera and Angelica and everyone in the room with any kind of lived experience of this. I think the other thing that comes through in our research, in my research, is that older people don't live on an island. Older people are connected with other generations. So when we prevent older people from, or some older people from also accruing wealth, that doesn't just have an immediate impact on them, that has an ongoing intergenerational impact. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren are all going to miss out on the kind of security and opportunities in life that comes through having housing equity. So where we can think about securing housing models, I think in the short first instance, securing private rental is really important, making it fit for purpose, which it's just not. there's so much age discrimination and terrible conditions. It's just not good. People may be lucky and have a good situation, but it's largely discretionary under current, unfortunately, under the current pressures in the private rental sector. But social housing, community housing, co-purchase schemes, which actually enable older people to do the thing that is really important to them as well, which is also care for and enable the generations coming after them. We know people who are more secure, who are more affluent, are purchasing homes, who are investing, who are helping out their children and their grandchildren. It's possible to enable all people to have those opportunities as well. It shouldn't be restricted to only affluent older people.
Thank you. We've got a question coming in from the Zoom. I just need to open it. Hang on one second. So this is from Susan Davies in Queensland, who has, hang on a sec, sorry, too many apps open. Okay, here we go. Long question. Susan Davies Sharing with Friends, which is a Queensland co-housing scheme building its first community in Brisbane, has encountered barriers for their affordable model at every step of the way, including the Building Code, the State Planning Act. What she's proposing is a national campaign about gentle density that popularises the idea of older people's co-housing as a wonderful solution for the missing middle. Does anyone have any comments and where to start?
And I just want to say hi to Susan and completely acknowledge the barriers that they've come up against in terms of where do certain models sit in the planning system. And it's not, I think it's not a new story for new types of housing, that once we start to see any type of innovation, we come up against that. And this sounds really, well, not awful, but, it'll be projects like Susan's and Sharing with Friends. Other people will get the benefit out of that. So that, the length of time it's taken for them to be able to get to navigate that maze, will be a benefit to others. I mean, one of the ways that I think it potentially could be done is through the planning blueprint, which came out of National Cabinet, which was about the planning reform agenda. So there are a number of elements in there that related to better housing outcomes. So I would think that could be a particularly good place to start. So there were a number of elements that related to density, had things relating to, say, secondary dwellings, so that sort of building and planning. So I think that would be a good place to start to somehow get that fed back through the planning blueprint reform.
There's another question here that's from Judy that says, housing equity schemes that I have heard a number of economists stating that this is a distortion to fix a distortion and will only lead to higher housing costs. Your comments would be appreciated.
I probably disagree with that, and that's simply because and I'll start by talking about the sort of first home buyer generation, and then apply it to the older missing middle. There are very limited ways that young people can purchase property in this country. Somebody dies and you get an inheritance. You have a supportive family who will give you tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Or in extremely rare cases, you have capacity to generate the kind of income that is 10 to 20 times the average salary in which to obtain a mortgage. We can apply that to the missing middle as well. There is really limited ways of accessing home ownership in this country without significant pots of money. So when people say, oh, but the shared equity scheme is going to be inflationary, when the shared equity scheme is allowing people who would otherwise be renting into the market or who would otherwise be homeless into the market. It's not necessarily creating an increase of supply. The demand is already there. We already have these people who want to obtain home ownership. And the numbers that we're talking are so infinitesimal that it is nothing on any of the other, super for housing, getting an extra, well, if you're lucky enough to have 20 grand in your super by age 30, but 20 grand immediately to put into a house. We're actually talking about not putting inflationary mechanisms in there at the moment. So I probably disagree that it would be inflationary. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it is something that people talk about, so it's really important to respond to. I strongly agree that the numbers are actually so small, but even if they were scaled, we don't really have evidence that that has happened in other contexts. More immediate, if you like, if we're thinking about addressing upward pressures on house prices, are other low-hanging fruit. So that really is being bold enough, brave enough to continue the conversations, the kind of difficult cultural Australian conversations now around reform of negative gearing and capital gains tax exemptions. These are far more prevalent across the country. They're far more influential in increasing house prices. And if we really want to think about macro interventions for stabilising house prices, this is the spot to start. And if we can't remove those altogether, let's at least target them really well for new supply.
I was just going to add, I think I'd be more concerned by the fact that you've still got states and territories, and particularly the Northern Territory. The new government's brought in a first-time owners grant that's upwards of $50,000, for new supply. That bothers me much more than what shared equity can do. And the other one, when you talk about being able to access your super for a deposit, I mean, we may as well just throw petrol on fire. In terms of what that would do to the housing market. Not only, I think, in terms of what it would do to the housing market, but, it still remains only accessible to a very wealthy group of people who have had the benefit of secure long-term employment, which is likely to be, long-term public servants.
We've got time for one more question, and then we've got lunch at the back. Okay, do you want to go? Yep. It's okay, I can come down. While I'm coming to you, I just want to have part the thought about the barrier of loans before we finish up, about how we can address that. Yes, my name's Robin. Now, Julijana, I'm 79 years of age, and I live in a rental property in Belgrave, the Dandenong Ranges. Now, it's a very old house. The owners, young people inherited it, refused to spend any money on it at all. Asbestos roof, doesn't have insulation, etc., etc. The compliance officer came out last year and he didn't pass it. He said the only reason he passed it is because he didn't want me and my old dog to be homeless. Now, I've lived in the Dandenong Ranges now for several years. I'm very well known for my environmental work. I have an Australia Day Award from the Shire of Yarra Ranges for my environmental work. I'm a leading person at the moment on stopping the logging that's going on in the Dandenong Ranges, and also the unnecessary storm cleanup. I'm very instrumental in highlighting the lack of protection for the birds. There's a whole lot of things here that I'm very involved in. I'm a very important part of that community and I'm very respected. Now, I also, with the house that I'm renting, I accidentally tripped over my husband's ashes, and instead of picking them up with a dustpan and broom, I put them in the garden. So he's there, the old cat's buried there. So very much I am a member of that community. But now with the, thank goodness the government is bringing in compliance laws, but now I'm in danger
of actually losing that house if it does become condemned. And I know of other people around me where the owners are not prepared to spend money on bringing these houses up to scratch. Now, at 79 years of age with some money, is there something that can be done for somebody like me to remain in this old house, not have it condemned, not have it pulled down, so I can stay there and still remain in the community that I'm very much a part of? Is there something that can happen to help people like me?
Well, Robin, firstly, congratulations on your decades of service to your community and environmental activism. It sounds like you play a very critical role in that community. So congratulations and thank you for providing that. That's a really tricky question. And I'm really sorry that your landlords are treating you in the way that they are. That's extremely, extremely distressing. And and it is common. Like, let's not pretend that they're unique in that. I think that we're getting into the realm of rental reforms and rental laws. And I mean, there are different solutions. Whether you'd be able to remain in the house specifically would be extremely would be difficult, and you probably want to look at some kind of government grants to preserve heritage properties, or perhaps there could be a conversation around that. There's a new Victorian government scheme, and to be clear, I don't speak on behalf of the Victorian government or the federal government, where Labor Housing is very much an activist group within the party, and we sort of just play a role in guiding and advocating for policy. But I wonder whether looking at the new Victorian rules around having granny flats and small dwellings on properties, would looking at that and having a conversation with your landlord about whether they could invest in putting a granny flat on your property so that you can stay on there, so that you can stay in the community. There is a big Victorian scheme around increasing supply across the state and the Dandenong ranges. I think there's got to be another 200,000 houses within that shire. So is there another dwelling that's going to be made available through that supply pitch, that although you may not be able to live on that property, perhaps you could continue to visit that property and find somewhere within your community as well? But that's a really tricky situation, Robin.
I'm sorry to have to wrap this up. It's a really good conversation. I just did want to say one more thing about the interest rates. Not interest rates, sorry, about bank loans. So we've mentioned a couple of times that these shared equity schemes exist. We don't believe that they're inflationary, but it's not possible for people to access them without bank loans. Is there any opportunity, and I don't know if we have an answer to this is perhaps something to park, where the government can be the person that has the loan and the person provides the 5% or the 10% deposit, rather than relying on a commercial bank loan? I don't know if we have an answer. I might have to leave it there, but if there's a couple word comments from anyone on the panel, then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. I think this is part of the complexity of the system that people are experiencing, and similarly across systems, across renting, local laws, state laws, federal. The part of the piece that we haven't really spoken today about, that comes through in this work a little bit, but comes through very strongly with other work we've done around housing across generational groups, actually, is just the lack of supported, available, free, accessible navigational support, as well as the kind of structural reforms which we're calling for, which are absolutely urgent. We hear from so many people about the complexity of actually just having to navigate social security, banking, finance, local laws, purchasing, rental. We did have Dr. Heather Holst here, the Victorian Residential Tenancies Commissioner. Actually, it's a shame she had to leave before your question, but just some kind of service which is actually free, is geared towards supporting not only older people, but across the housing and associated systems, is really lacking. People who can afford it can get good advice. people who can't are really just bumping around in the dark often. And I think that the banking sector is really one of those areas where government assistance, but also information support is really needed.
So we do have a couple of extra questions, but I'm afraid we don't have time. But what we're going to do is we'll put them all to the panellists and the researchers who are here today, and we'll put some answers to those questions on our website, and we'll email them around by our e-bulletin. Can we have the last slide, please, Ruben? I just wanted to say that there's a federal election coming up, and this is a really good idea, a good time to be pressuring people that are in government or considering becoming into government to really take housing seriously. We're getting ready for the federal election. We will be having a bunch of different policy recommendations which we think will address some of these issues. Some of those are on our infographic at the back. And we have also broken those into solutions for various different people, the people that need public housing, the people that need community housing, the people that need shared equity schemes, the people that need assistance to stay in their homes. So all of those policies are, feel free to grab something at the back and check out our website. Also, if there is anybody that is in Victoria and requiring housing support, our Home at Last service can assist. And of course, we always would encourage people to become members of Housing for the Aged Action Group and members of National Shelter to continue this important policy and advocacy work. I just wanted, before we finish up, we do have some food to share for the people that are not online, the in-person people. And I just wanted to give a big shout out to the team at HAG who have put this together, especially Dinny, who's about to have a baby at any moment. And the team that have joined us today, Ruben and Claire and Ira and Ali and Rebecca and all of the housing support team who are here and the retirement housing team. So again, thank you to everyone for coming today. This is a really important conversation and it's not over. We really want to get some solutions on the table and get this happening. So yeah, feel free to get involved.